So I just want to first say thanks for sending me that article about education inequality. That was really eye-opening and interesting.
No, I'm glad you liked it because it's funny because there was a class that I took probably a couple years ago, and that was just something that we did in class, and I thought it was really interesting because it's relevant to like the economics and racial inequality that we're talking about, but kind of the fact that education levels are involved with it, I think is really important because not that it's often overlooked in society, but I just think it's really important to understand like the discrepancies when race and economic status are involved, how like connected they really are, because I think that's something I've missed in the past.
No, I definitely agree. I feel like growing up with a school that was predominantly white, I feel like I also missed that and like being privileged growing up. And I think that it's definitely beneficial to look into this stuff because I do think you're right. It is very overlooked. What class did you have to read that for?
Oh my goodness. I think this was one of my keystone classes for my women and gender studies major.
Okay.
But something you just said kind of sparked a question in my mind. I heard you say that like growing up privileged in a predominantly white school, when you like entered in your school to look up, the different demographics and the grade levels, were you surprised by the findings that you saw on like the scattered plot chart?
I'm really happy that you asked that because I actually went through and did a lot of schools in my area. I'm from West Michigan.
Okay.
So I went to Granville High School,
okay.
And my school was 1.1 grades ahead of the average.
Okay.
Which I was somewhat surprised, but not really. I do think it was less than some other area schools just because I am from a middle to maybe slightly lower class.
Okay.
And the diversity in my hometown really does show that.
Okay.
And so that was interesting to me. But one thing that I wanted to talk about with you that really struck me was Grand Rapids Public Schools are 2.1 grades behind the average. But East Grand Rapids, which is not even a mile away, is 2.1 grades ahead.
Wow. Wow. Interesting.
Isn't that crazy?
That's really crazy.
It hurt.
I'm not from Michigan, so I don't know much about Grand Rapids. But when you were looking up and saw how huge that's 4 grade levels difference between the two, which when you were looking those up and it gave the little breakdown of race in each school, what was East Grand Rapids compared to Grand Rapids Public Schools? Do you know that?
I do a little bit, also just from experience.
Oh, sure.
But East Grand Rapids is more predominantly white.
Okay.
And is more of the white population of the Grand Rapids area. And Grand Rapids Public is more minority based.
Okay.
So
you could definitely see that the statistics were reflective in what was found, especially from, you said, experience. So that way you know firsthand that what you're reading on paper in actuality is reflective of that.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think for me, when I looked up my school, it's interesting because I came from a small school in Ohio, and our school stood out from the rest of them in that if you drove through our town, you knew you were in Granville without a D. But then our surrounding towns that quite literally that circled us they all looked like the same, like you couldn't distinguish between them. But you knew you were in Granville because it was very colonial. Everything had like white picket fence, newly paved roads, but it was very tiny. And it's where Denison University is, but it's like if you blink, you could drive through it, but it stood out because of the wealth. And I always knew that growing up, people were like, their parents were quite literally doctors and lawyers and stuff, or they owned their own company or were engineers and everything. But when I looked at the breakdown of demographics, our breakdown of our high school was 95% white, 3% Asian, 1% Black, and 1% Hispanic. Not surprised by it. And quite frankly, everyone I saw but my best friend Morgan was white. Morgan was biracial. She was white and Black, and I was just shocked. But we're 2.1 grade levels above average, and our median family income is $120,000. That's the average for the whole town. Wow. So I was kind of surprised. That it was that high just because I think as an average, that's a really high number.
Mm-hmm.
Not shocked that people make more than that, but I guess as like a community average, I was shocked because I'm from a very strong middle class family, but my both of my parents, like one didn't go to college, my mom did. She paid her way through school. She she did a lot of things on her own without help from her parents,
Mm-hmm.
but she went to a good high school, so I looked hers up too, just to kind of see how like race was involved in it. And hers was also 2.1 grade levels above average, and that median income, and that was, granted, this is today. I don't know what it was like for my mom when she attended high school, so that's kind of unfair.
Mm-hmm.
But today it's still like 90,000. So it's still, you can see that even though, I mean, that's only a $30,000 difference.
Right.
But traditionally, like there is, and they were, I think, 93% white in the majority. So a massive, massive majority is reflective in Caucasian Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even it said there wasn't enough reflective of data for Asian American
Right.
families, which I thought was interesting because
Mm-hmm.
I think we always talk about like whites, black, Latinos, and we don't talk about the Asian population as much. But my school had more Asian than black Latino in it. So, I mean, obviously, incredibly, it's 5% in the minority, but
Mm-hmm.
that kind of surprised me, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Going off of what you're saying, I do wonder, you said your hometown was like colonial, like picket fence looking and
Yeah.
like very small. Would you say that most of your minority students came from your part of town, or do you think they came into your town to go to school? Like, how do you think that population was affected within the school? Because in the article, it was talking about there's a lot of outliers due to minorities,
Mm-hmm.
and they are not necessarily like in the area.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if you can maybe elaborate more on that.
That's a very, very interesting question. I know from personal conversations with minorities that I went to school with, because I think this data was collected in 2014. But when I was there, I graduated in 2010, so not that far off.
Mm-hmm.
I think with the minority population, one of them would have definitely been an outlier and came into our school because they were part of the foster system. And actually, two of them might have been. One was a senior and one was a freshman, brother and sister, but they stayed with the same foster family, which was a white foster family, and they were African American.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, I think it's interesting to think about that, because it's a white family who's living in the town,
Mm-hmm.
and then the racial minority that's reflected is not necessarily representative of, again, the town, but of a system bringing them into that population.
Mm-hmm.
And then other ones, I did know one of the Asian students, and her dad was like a neurosurgeon, and I think it was just incredibly smart, very fortunate, well off, was an immigrant, I know that much, married an American woman, so she was biracial, but they just, and I don't know if the mom lived in Granville and then when dad got married they came or whatever, but
Mm-hmm.
I do think that the minorities kind of came in a different way, because our town is just very much diverse in a political way, not in a racial way.
Okay.
So while you might look at it and be like, wow, this looks stereotypically, and I don't like generalizations, but kind of like a conservative town, it actually wasn't. We had a really strong LGBT population. I went to school with 3 transgender students. Everyone was really open to where they were conservative and where they were liberal on things, but no one really cared. Like it was really so much about the individual person. So it'd be interesting to see if we had more racial minority, if like that would have even been a factor and if people really would have paid attention to it,
Mm-hmm.
but we just didn't get that opportunity. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like as opposed to like maybe Grand Rapids where the diversity is a lot stronger
Mm-hmm.
in public schools, but I mean even in East Grand Rapids where you are, it's not like
Mm-hmm.
it's not as diverse. So
Right.
I think that hurts in a little bit, in a little way.
Yeah. No, it definitely does. And I think it's really interesting that you bring up other kinds of diversity just because I feel like it'd be interesting to do a study about like political diversity in education and where people come from and that kind of concept too. I think that predominantly race and class kind of are together at this point, so I think this study was really relatable to what we're talking about in class.
Absolutely.
And I really appreciated that. But I'm really interested to look into other factors too, especially after our discussion in class about education the other day too. So
do you think, after you saying that, do you think that because you said we kind of look at race and economics as together now, do you think personally you can look at those two things separately, or you're always going to have to look at them with the lens that they are always connected from now on?
That's a good question. For me personally, I have never fully experienced that.
Okay.
One of my best friends is Black, and out of our friend group, my friend group from home, we're two of the people with like the more like upper class houses in our hometown, and she's Black, Black family. So it's like for me, it was really shocking to see so much correlation with that, and it really hurt me just because like of the community and like where people are and where they come from, and it was really hard for me to swallow that race is a part of that. And just looking at the charts, I was very baffled, especially the one with even like poor whites and poor minorities, and how the white students were still getting a more superior education compared to the minorities, and that really hurt me too, because it's like the education system, it seemed racist to me, and that really struck me as hurtful and painful to see.
I appreciate you like being open about that feeling, because it's like you said you were hurt several times, and I think it's interesting that you had the comparison with one of your best friends who was Black, but you were both pretty much on the same level economically, but overall, asking the bigger question, and maybe not intentionally, but you saying like, well, the education system is racist. Well, it's like maybe there is a really big problem in the education system perpetuating, racial inequality, but now we see even more clearly how economics is reflective of that educational standard. And I think that's really scary realization, but I really appreciate and kind of like I'm truly inspired by you saying that you're hurt by it, because I think when we can acknowledge that, this isn't a good thing, that's kind of like the first step to say like, well, how do we correct this? Like, what is that next step? Which I'm not asking you that because that's a really big question, but it's also like you can't ignore that part of it, that's being an active, agent of change for hopefully a better system, or at least just targeting that, there's an entire population based solely on skin color that's not benefiting from the same education that I am, and that's really unfair. So I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, thanks for acknowledging that. I think what's next is a really important question, and I think that it's good that you're bringing that up too, because I feel like I looked at it and was a lot more defeated, and I think you're looking at it more of like a what's next, what can we do, an optimistic feeling, and I really appreciate you bringing that perspective also.
Thank you.
So